So one big question people might have about these portable sawmills is how productive they are. How fast can you turn a log into usable lumber? And that's a complicated question. It's going to depend primarily on two factors. The first being your individual process, how you have your operation set up from, piled wood to lumber stack. And the second and probably most important factor is going to be the size of the wood. Milling smaller stems is going to result in less production, less board feet per hour. Milling larger logs is going to result in higher production counts. Now that may seem obvious, but what isn't necessarily obvious, especially if you haven't operated these mills extensively, is the extent to which this affects production. After all, larger logs are heavier, they're harder to handle, so how much does this negate any sort of productive gain? And is there a diminishing return after a certain size? Well, I wanted to answer the question in a more or less scientific manner, so I conducted a little experiment. I timed how long it took to produce different sized cants, 4x4, 6x6, 8x8, and 10x10. Now, if you're not aware, the cant is essentially the squared log. It is the blank from which you can actually cut boards. And what I measured was the time it took to take the log off the pile onto the mill and get to that blank cant state. Now, the reason I wanted to time how long it took to get to this particular state was because from there, the production is going to depend primarily on what type of boards you're cutting. If you're cutting 1x, it's going to obviously take longer than if you're cutting 2x. And also basing it off of the diameter of the log is a bit more complicated than basing it off of the finished product. And I felt like that just added a few too many variables to what should otherwise be a pretty basic experiment. So keep that in mind. We aren't actually talking about a finished product. We're talking about the cant. That's probably about 80% of the work involved with milling. And of course, it doesn't factor in other things like drying or other processes that you might have in your particular operation. So with that said, let's look at what I found. The 4x4 cant took 7 minutes and 9 seconds, producing 13.3 board feet, resulting in 111.7 board feet per hour. The 6x6 cant took 8 minutes and 14 seconds, producing 30 board feet and resulting in 218.9 board feet per hour. The 8x8 cant took 10 minutes and 26 seconds, producing 53.3 board feet, resulting in 308.1 board feet per hour. The 10x10 cant took 12 minutes and 25 seconds, producing 83.3 board feet, resulting in 402.4 board feet per hour. So when that's graphed out, we get a really cool linear relationship. It is way more linear than I expected, to be honest. Basically, for every 2 inches in cant dimension, you get 100 more board feet per hour. Now, this is by no means a universal rate of production. I am cutting low density balsam fir. And if you're working with a wood like sugar maple, then your handling of the wood is going to represent more time. Even moving the finished boards could be problematic with that sort of a situation. So you're going to have more physical challenges, equipment limitations, and so forth. But even in that situation, the relationship between stem size and production will remain constant. It might be a little more curved, it might be a little more diminishing towards the top end, but it's going to remain. And so there's a very important lesson here. Now, this mill right here is advertised as being able to mill up to 26-inch diameter logs. So how do you maximize the production on a portable sawmill like this one here? The answer is you have to push through as many 26-inch diameter logs as possible. And that's something I really want to drive home because it's fascinating to me. There really is like an economic trinity in forestry. I've done videos before about how larger trees tend to be more productive on a growth basis. I've done videos about how larger trees are more productive on a harvesting and logging basis. And now we're looking at how larger trees are more productive on a milling basis. Forest economics is really not that complicated. 80% of it is just growing trees to the appropriate size. Really, that's all it is. So when people say that these mills are slow or impractical, that's not really my takeaway. It really just depends on the size of wood you're milling and what your exact purposes are. So unless you're cutting some sort of specialty product, like you're making some unique wood product out of diseased beech or something, I really wouldn't mill anything less than 8 inches in top size diameter. I have gone smaller than that. I've cut down to a 4-inch top size, but I only did that a few times before I basically just gave up and started throwing those pieces in the firewood pile. And honestly, it's not even about productivity at that level. It's just about any small defect, any small sweep is just going to destroy any sort of yield you get out of that log. So I just found, it wasn't worth it. It really gave me a lot of insight into why so many boards from Home Depot are subpar, to be honest. But the other crucial factor here that I alluded to earlier is your process. Because remember, just cutting the cant doesn't account for things like how you move the boards from the mill to a stack, how you deal with that stack after the stack is completed, and how those boards are dried. It also doesn't address how you deal with waste products like edges and sawdust. In my situation, for example, I had my operation set up so my forwarding trailer grapple could move the logs directly from the log pile onto my mill. And that was excellent. Like, that was a near perfect process. It worked flawlessly. It saved a bunch of time, a bunch of hassle. It was great. But something I didn't pay too much attention to, which honestly is probably a behavioral pattern of mine at this point, is I really just paid attention to how I was going to turn the log into lumber. And then I didn't really plan anything about dealing with the waste product. So my waste processing facility was just atrocious. It was horrible. I started out just kind of I had a bonfire going as I was cutting, and I would just take the edges and throw them into the bonfire. And then I was like, well, I'm producing a lot of edges here, so I should probably just cut this into firewood instead of just always having a huge bonfire going when I'm trying to cut, especially when it got drier. So I started trying to process it into firewood, but I just didn't have anything set up, so it just turned into a giant mess. But like if you're doing this as more than just a hobby, or you want to make it a financially productive hobby, or even delve into the world of legitimate business, you really want to nail down how you're going to deal with that. Because honestly, like, being able to turn edges into firewood, that can be a lucrative source of revenue. So if I were doing this on a more consistent and established basis, I'd honestly consider getting some sort of firewood processor set up so I could more directly move the edges onto the processor and easily process that into firewood after I was done with the logs or at the end of the day, and try to keep it fairly close to the milling facility themselves. Because honestly, from like 10 cords of logs, I'm probably gonna get like 3 cords of firewood, if not more. And even my process of moving around the finished boards could have been a lot better. Now I am dealing with some self-imposed restrictions here. I have very little space to work with. As you can see, there's like trees in between me and the lumber yard, so to speak. So I'm not really the best example of that, but what could be very productive, I think, is you start the day with pallets very close to you, and you can just move the wood onto pallets and then move those pallets around with a fork on your tractor or something like that. It's just going to depend on your situation. And I really can't speak to the specifics there because it does depend so much on what you want to get out of your own situation, whether or not you're doing something more mobile like me, whether or not you're creating a whole compound in your backyard, whether you're doing it as just like a retirement hobby, whether or not you want to make some money on the side. I can't answer those questions, and it's very difficult to experiment with those sorts of things without sinking in a lot of capital. So I'm not going to do that. But I do think we all kind of have to examine the efficiency of our own processes regardless of the situation, because I think too often we compare the unoptimized to the optimized, and it gives us a false perception of what could be. So to kind of explain what I mean, consider a very common error or fallacy that manufacturers make. And that is when they compare unoptimized human labor to optimized robotic or automated labor. So say you're in a factory making widgets and you're depending on human labor to make these widgets. Now, your human workers they're infinitely flexible and they're fairly intelligent, so they can adapt to changing conditions, they can search for drawers, they can change tasks pretty readily, and so forth. And you just kind of coast on the knowledge that they can do this. And so you never really worry too much about the actual efficiency of their individual labor. And one day you think, well, you know what, those human laborers are pretty expensive, so maybe we should try to find a robot to replace them. So you start looking at 6-axis robots. Those are those fancy ones that car manufacturers use. And you try to adapt the process for making these widgets so it's doable by a stationary 6-axis robot. So you got a lot of axes of movement, but the robot's still stationary. So you have to kind of adjust your processes a little bit, maybe have like a conveyor belt, something like that. And then you look at the costs of this machine and you think, well, you know what, this 6-axis robot's really expensive both to purchase and to maintain, so maybe we can do this with a 3-axis machine. So you have far less axes of movement and the robot's still stationary, so you have to kind of improve your process even more. And you're able to do this, and you look, and this very simple machine is doing this very simple task, and you're like, wow, it's so cheap. It's so much cheaper than human labor. Well, no, because what you're comparing is an unoptimized human labor situation to an optimized robotic situation. So you took that human flexibility for granted and never really honed in the process, and then you compared it to something that you rigorously improved to make sure it could be done in the stupidest way possible with a 3-axis robot. The problem is you also removed the benefit you got from that flexibility and the potential future process improvements you could get from the intelligence of the individual workers. And this fallacy is a reason why automation attempts frequently fail. People act like it's an inevitability or a no-brainer, but that's really not the case. There's many situations where it doesn't work that well. But my point with all this is just to say that oftentimes people with these machines aren't really examining their own process. And then they're comparing their production to an industrial mill with a board of 10 MBAs. Not that that's always a net good. But you know, these highly optimized mills that have just teams of very intelligent people working for them, those aren't comparable situations. And so especially before I got this thing operational, I watched a lot of sawmill content on YouTube, you know, people kind of explaining things, tutorial videos and so forth. And man, some guys, like, they'll pressure wash every single log before they start. They'll meticulously level the pith. They are very thoughtful in their approach, to say the least. And you know, if you're milling up black walnut or you want to produce a very high quality product for woodworking, more power to you. But more often than not, people are cutting yellow poplar or something like that. And at a certain point, you just have to do a cost-benefit analysis. And so if you really want to do that, of course, that's your prerogative. I mean, I love milling, so I do understand. But let's remember that when we go to Home Depot, a lot of those boards, they're full of knots, they are curvy, they're not the highest quality. So let's at least compare the same practices. But that brings me to my last point with all this, which is to ask, is production really all that important anyway? And the answer is not necessarily. I think there are 3 situations where it really doesn't matter how productive or unproductive you actually are with your sawmill. Scenario 1 is you just want to have fun, and that's most of you guys. If you're just doing this as a hobby, or you just love being out in the woods working, and you just want to mill every log perfectly every single time, have at it. I'm not trying to diminish that at all. Personally, fun for me is kind of optimizing production. I like to see how much I can cut in a day, but I'm a weird dude, I understand that. Scenario 2, which is my situation, is your sawmill is a forest management tool. And this is not necessarily about your process or how fast you're milling, and more just about what size wood you're cutting. Obviously, I said earlier that it's good to cut as many big logs as possible, but if you're coming at this from a more forest management perspective, if you're trying to manage your own forest, that's not necessarily optimum, because you want to try to thin your forest, you want to try to remove the lower quality stuff. And let me tell you, like, this is such a great tool for that. It is amazing. I started out actually selling to a mill, and that was so complicated. I had to get the mill contract, I had to coordinate trucking, I had to make sure that I was cutting enough volume to actually get truckloads of wood. And that's not necessarily practical for most people. So a much better alternative to that is to get a portable sawmill, and it's gonna pay for itself within, like, I don't know, 3 loads of wood. And that way you can cut small volumes, you can do it at your own pace, you can cut a little every year if you want, you can do it in you know, batches here and there, maybe every like 3 years you do a somewhat sizable harvest, something like that. It is super fit and convenient for that type of situation, but you will be cutting smaller logs. And the reason is you're doing intermediate harvest. You're trying to make your forest more healthy, more productive, and bigger for the future. And so who really cares about the productivity of the mill? It's just a management tool. It's just allowing you to get usable products from those intermediate harvests. And scenario 3 is you aren't actually selling a commodity product. If you are selling standardized dimensional lumber, then yeah, productivity is going to matter quite a bit. That's a productivity game. But if you are positioned in more niche or boutique markets, if you're producing, I don't know, Adirondack siding or live edge slabs or something like that, or maybe if you're trying to make, you know, shelves at a diseased beach or something. I want to try that myself. That's why I keep bringing it up. Anyway, yeah, in those sort of situations, you can command more value per unit of volume of wood. So the production is, I mean, you still want to, you know, produce, but it's not strictly a production game, and it's more about, yeah, commanding value. And honestly, if you're trying to build a viable enterprise as a small-scale sawmill, I think you do need to at least incorporate that sort of situation into your strategy. So anyway, that's all I have for you today, just a shorter video about production rates and sawmills. But I did want to make this video. I think it's an important concept to understand, and I didn't see too much on YouTube addressing it. So I wanted to actually do a more or less formal test to really demonstrate it. And I have been absolutely swamped with various projects lately, so my video releases haven't been as frequent as I would like. But I promise I have some very exciting things coming, so subscribe if you want to hear more about that, because I have a lot more coming. And also, don't forget, if you want to learn more about forest management and managing your own forest, don't forget to sign up for my email list and grab How to Read Your Forest, which is a great beginner's guide into a lot of these concepts around silviculture, forest management, and so forth. I don't have much in there about sawmilling. Hopefully that'll come in the next edition. So anyway, that's all for now. I'll catch you later.